The Taliban Resurgence after their fall in 2001 in Afghanistan Dissertation. The Taliban militants who fought the US and the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, troops were persuaded by an alternate set of factors than the group of the young madrasa learners that at first were part of the association during the mid-1990s. At that point, the Taliban was basically inspired by the longing to build up a perfect Islamic state administered by the Sharia law. Pakistan has given an excellent sponsorship to Afghanistan in the midst of the Soviet invasion. It offered refuge to more than 3 million Afghan pariahs and still plays host to very nearly 2 million of them. Pakistan was allowed to sit alone to manage the issues connected with the outcomes of the war. Taking after the 9/11 assaults, the Americans announced a war against Afghanistan. But the outcome of the war destroyed much of the resources and the infrastructure that was in place. It is, therefore, true to conjecture that the insurgency in Afghanistan was as a result of the inefficiency and the inability of the government to counter and resolve the challenges faced by the country and the citizens. Introduction. Afghanistan borders Iran, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and China. The country is located in the southern part of Asia. The proximity of its location has led to many battles in the past due to the interest developed by many rulers in the past, such as Alexander the Great. These battles have dented the history of the country. Afghanistan is a country rich in culture and heritage, thus, there are several ethnic communities and the topmost spoken dialects are Dari and Pashto. The citizens are tied up to their religion, as the religion is the basis of their culture and identity. The widely practiced religion in the area is Islam. The religion has so many branches and the most of the Muslims in Afghanistan are of the Sunni descent and, therefore, practice the Sunni tradition. The Islamic religion acts as the unifying force. It united the Afghans to resist the British forces in the 19th century and the Soviet forces in the 20th century, Ahadi 2005. Afghanistan is further segregated to various social, cultural and ethnic divisions. The dominant ethnic groups are the Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks, Arni 2006. The Pashtuns speak the Pashto dialect. The Tajiks speak the Dari dialect. The Hazaras and the Uzbeks speak the Shiites and the Uzbek dialects respectively. Until now, the Pashtuns are regarded to be the biggest minority ethnic group. The Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks follow in that order. This means that out of the 4 biggest tribes, none of them is considered to be the majority. This has led to several scholars terming Afghanistan as a country of minorities, Ahadi 2005. The conflicts in the country have gone on and on for at least 25 years. These conflicts have since triggered tribal animosities among the ethnic communities. But the overall war in the country did not happen as a result of the ethnic polarization in the country. Nonetheless, it cannot be ignored that the ethnic divisions have played a role in catalyzing the conflicts. Other scholars attribute the insurgency in Afghanistan to have been caused by inadequate security, instability of the economy, and the ideological differences between the ethnic groups. There was smooth talk from the American administration about all decisions being open. They arbitrated the uneven military operations in the tribal belt. To be sure, even the current president, Barack Obama, has joined the topic, in spite of the way that he has qualified his remarks by saying that if at all there is essential information about high-regard targets he would orchestrate surgical operations and military strikes inside the Pakistani area, Banas 2005. Notwithstanding the crippling tone of the Bush Association, there was a developing affirmation in America that this war must be won through winning over the hearts and brains of people and not by utilization of military imperative alone. Who are the Taliban? The Taliban insurgents are responsible for the operations of the Taliban's military. They normally direct the war from their provinces, which act as their base. Nevertheless, the impact of cliques like the Haqqani network and connections to both Al-Qaeda and the Tehrik-i-Taliban, TTP, or Pakistani Taliban, demonstrate that as the contention proceeds, the Afghan Taliban could be affected by the players with more local and even worldwide desires. The current US system of debasing the Taliban to drive it to dialogue is having unplanned impacts. The most genuine of these is adding to the ascent of more youthful, more radical Taliban officers who are assuming the positions of the neo-Taliban, a cycle of the revolt with a more jihadist internationalist perspective. From the Americans' perspective, the peace deals made by Pakistan's army with the activists in the tribal belt have failed to bring peace, BNS 2005. Surprisingly, they have given a space to the activists to develop their effect within the region and have offered rising to expanded militancy. It is profoundly apparent that militancy in FATA is also indigenous. There exists a system of radicalism and terrorism, and this is maintained by the skilled radical groups in the tribal belt. These structures, surrounded in Pakistan to fight the control of the Soviets, have not been totally dismantled and have now recreated as power centers. One of the essential clarifications behind the resurgence of the Taliban in both Afghanistan and Pakistan is poor organization and colossal pollution, BNS 2000. There is a wide gap between how the war on apprehension is seen by the Americans and the Pakistan's organization. America obviously is more stressed over the overall method for the danger rather than Pakistan's organization, considering it to be a risk to its inside quality and the radicalization of the region. The two governments need to develop a prevalent converging of their interests as to tending to the terrorist dangers. This ends up being more basic in regards to the currently approved establishment, which bars help unless the American president finds Pakistan is making certain, paramount, and supervised progress toward disposing of outside support or place of asylum for the terrorists, Arni 2006. This order has gotten genuine criticism in Pakistan both at the lawmaking body and the general public, and there is a conviction that the US is not quick to respond to Pakistan's efforts and continues driving its short-lived preferences to the weakening of Pakistan. How did the Taliban emerge in Afghanistan? Taliban started in 1979. At this time, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. In 1973, the Soviet Union came into Afghanistan with their troopers asserting to remake the devastating economy. Nonetheless, the Soviet was hated by the Mujahideen, which is the origin of the Taliban. In the meantime, the Soviet Union and Americans were occupied with the Cold War. The Americans were really keen to counter power against the Soviets. In this way, the Soviets' passage in Afghanistan flagged their increment in force and quality, thereby increasing more power and quality. Therefore, the United States chose to intervene. These armies were known as the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were supported both financially and technically by a few nations including the Americans, the Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, BNS 2005. There are a couple reasons why the two governments question each other. An essential irritation is that dynamic Afghan governments have yet to totally adapt to the reality of the Durand Line as far as possible between the two countries. Moreover, in the midst of times of the Cold War, Afghanistan stayed conformed to the Soviet camp and Pakistan was a partner of the US and a dynamic individual from the CENTO and CETO security settlements, Rashid 2000. The India segment was another bone of contention, and even today expects a negative part in their relationship. Islamabad has conveyed its significant faltering about India's establishment of a couple of divisions in the closeness of its edges and sees these to be getting a charge out of activities obstructing to its national points of interest, Rashid 2009. Pakistan's modestly generous size and resource base conversely with Afghanistan provoke a more noteworthy neighbor issue in the brain of the nation. Accordingly, Kabul is always uneasy of Pakistan's common arrangements, and the way that Afghanistan is topographically landlocked makes it more dependent and flimsy, Riefenberg 2005. The administration of the former U.S. President, Reagan drove the Mujahideen to battle brutally against the Soviets and succeeded in driving them out, Chapman 2009. This unanticipated defeat brought on the Soviets to lose billions of dollars and prompted the breakdown of the Soviet Union after the war. Pakistan was allowed to sit alone to manage the issues connected with the outcomes of the war. Taking after the 9/11 assaults, the Americans announced a war against Afghanistan. The Taliban was a formation of the ISI, Pakistani intelligence agency, however, was supported by the US. The Americans had given at least $3.5 billion to assemble this Islamic clique by giving them ammo, which they neglected to monitor after the Soviet war. In this manner, the U.S. was surprised when the expensive and sophisticated weapons that they had given were currently being utilized against them. Chapman 2009. Since the Taliban was a production of the Pakistani intelligence agency, Pakistan had cold feet to battle them. It can be assumed that a considerable measure of Pakistani and other military individual took side with the Taliban during the war. It can also be assumed that the US is in charge of giving the Taliban technical and military guidance, alongside military equipment. In this way, the US and Pakistan are responsible for the formation of the Islamic fanatic group called the Taliban. Banas 2005. Why do the people join Taliban and fight the Afghan government? It is estimated that the total number of the insurgents is somewhere around 56,000 and 77,000. Out of this number, roughly 18,000 insurgents fight on a full-time basis. The airstrikes by the Americans combined with the ISAF counterinsurgency fighting and the Special Operations night assaults have harmed the association and made it scatter all through Afghanistan and over the fringe in Pakistan. Chapman 2009. Be that as it may, this is the same group that participates in the Mujahideen that removed the Soviets out of Afghanistan in the late 1980s. In spite of incurring many misfortunes, components of the rebellion stay certain that if its warriors can jumble along, the Taliban can make do until the American troops are pulled back from Afghanistan. This could certainly make it possible for another war to erupt in the Afghan region. The government. Is the government authoritarian? The government has not been authoritarian because it has failed in providing the most basic amenities to the people. It is weak and lacks the capacity to handle the urgency. Chandran 2003. The government has let so many social evils to pass under its watch. Further convoluting the power exertion in Afghanistan is that the Afghan government has been generally blamed for debasement and uncouthness, aggravating an officially troublesome dynamic mission for ISAF. The ability of the Taliban to recruit more radical youths is supported by the occurrence of constant corruption, which has stretched out from the most elevated ranges of the Afghan government to the lower-level authorities and security forces. By abusing the accounts of mistreatment, occupation, and debasement, the Taliban speaks to both religious defenses and patriot notions at the same time. The Taliban's publicity calls for the attention of the ISAF and the Afghan government. Among the most incessant subjects is the widespread debasement of the legislature. Was the government well organized? The acting government led by the former President Hamid Karzai did not win over the confidence of all the Afghans. There was rampant corruption and misuse of the government's resources. The political positions were allocated according to the ethnic divisions, and tribes like the Pashtuns started feeling inferior. The administration was not well organized as it failed to provide enough security to protect the country's territories. Of every single conceivable result in Afghanistan, the most essential to the United States is that Afghanistan never again turns into a nation that harbors international terrorists. Chandran 2003. From a practical point of view, the US is basically worried that whatever takes after its way out from Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda or a clique of its kind will not have the capacity to utilize the nation as a spot to plot, plan, and get underway assaults against the West. Quite a bit of this relies upon the condition of the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and also cliques of its kind. At this point, the tale of how the Taliban gave haven to Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda before the terrorists' attacks on the World Trade Center and declined to arrest him after the assaults is surely understood. All through the late 1990s and paving the way to the World Trade Center attacks, Al-Qaeda ran a parallel government close by the Taliban and even directed its own remote strategy autonomous from Mullah Omar's association. Mullah Omar was a commander of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He started the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, Chapman 2009. The Al-Qaeda has lately established connections with cliques in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, Mali, and even Nigeria. The missing link is the present condition of the alliance and what shape that alliance would take in a future Afghan government that incorporates Taliban individuals inside of its positions. The subject of the alliance between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is not a very large potential hindrance among the Taliban as normal intelligence holds. For incidental reasons, starting in 2007 the Taliban has taken impressive consideration in their open proclamations to certainly separate themselves from Al-Qaeda while offering clear signs of their irritation with the remote activists. Inside of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda's numbers are little, its influence has diminished, and its impact on basic leadership is likely insignificant, particularly after the demise of Osama bin Laden. The Taliban's connection with Al-Qaeda will end with an arranged peace accord. The Taliban's union with Al-Qaeda is a battling partnership, an accommodation of war. Regardless of the possibility that ISAF can underestimate Al-Qaeda, the preceding capacity of the Taliban to utilize Pakistan as asylum gives it a reasonable point of preference, Banas 2005. The uprising's objective ought to endure the Americans before coming back to Afghanistan after an American withdrawal and forcefully retake the nation. Toward the day's end, there is little the Americans can do with precision to compel the Pakistanis to dispose of this place of refuge. All things considered, Pakistan is an associate with 6 times the number of inhabitants in Iraq, notwithstanding a developing stockpile of atomic weapons. Of all the critical improvements in Afghanistan over the previous decade, none will be more telling than the stages quickly taking after the withdrawal of the Americans, NATO, and ISAF troops from Afghanistan. At that point, and at exactly that point, will the global group have an indication of what the future may hold. Weaknesses of the government. It is a notion of many scholars that a weak and a moribund government is a catalyst of the insurgency. This is due to the fact that when a government is weak and financially unstable, they are incapable of deploying the best police and security forces to counter the insurgency, Chase 2007. An effective government has the ability to end a war and bring the insurgency to an end because they have the capacity to organize relevant institutions that can bring the conflicts to an end and promote peace and security. An effective government will also set in place institutions that promote job creation and uplift the standards of living among the people. When there is a change of regime in any government, the country normally undergoes a state of anarchy. This is because most of the times, the domestic systems in the country are centralized and hierarchic. The systems of the stable governments vary from one government to another. When a government is weak, it becomes so impossible for it to fulfill the needs and the desires of the growing population. Many basic needs and services will not be provided. The government cannot function effectively due to the fact that there are no credible institutions to guide the operations of the government, Banas 2005. This will be evident in various sectors like education, justice, and government operations, whereby, the schools will lack properly trained teachers, the courts will lack qualified judges and the members of the judiciary and the government will lack the qualified personnel to manage the various ministerial dockets. As a result of these shortcomings, there could be rampant corruption in the country, Chase 2007. The after effects of corruption would mean that there would be a decline in the economic growth of the country. In addition, the rule of law would be undermined and at the same time, the government would be unable to supply the basic amenities to the population. The rise of an insurgency is an after effect of poor governance because there is poor accountability on the part of the state and also the rule of law is highly undermined. When a country is regarded as a failed state, it is highly unlikely to manage its territory, for instance, those areas inhabited by the radical groups. In his manner, the state's authority declines over a large segment of the population, Davis 2001. As a result of this, the non-state players will be interested in gaining control of the state due to its failure to manage its territories. This gives rise to the emergence of radical groups. Accordingly, the more a state loses its authority in an area, the more it becomes exposed and susceptible to the radicals who wish to form a parallel government. Jones 18. All these assumptions can hold in the case of Afghanistan. The emergence of the insurgency in Afghanistan can be attributed to the weak governance. Nonetheless, Afghanistan has failed twice as a result of weak governance after the Soviet deserted the country. In the first place, just after the failure of the Soviet regime, the anti-Soviet Mujahideen who had defeated the Soviet gained control of the state Chase 2007 divided by. At this period, many warlords used the opportunity to gain more power and exercise violence to fulfill their personal interests and further destabilize the government. As a result of this, the country was in a state of anarchy due to constant conflicts and clashes. Many scholars attribute this period to be the precondition for the emergence of the insurgency. The Taliban managed to capture Afghanistan because they were heavily supported by the Pakistanis who provided weapons and military personnel. Davis 2001. The Pakistanis also trained the rebels and provided technical support to the Taliban. At the time when the Taliban captured Afghanistan, they took control over several areas apart from the Panjshir Valley, which was considered to the stronghold of the anti-Taliban. The other evidence of the weak governance of Afghanistan was evident when the Taliban regime fell in 2001. After the Taliban regime fell, the country was in a state of anarchy. The new government did not have the capacity to gain control of all areas of the country. This limited its reign to just a few areas around Kabul. The UN and the Afghan government formed an agreement on December 5, 2001, called the Bonn Agreement, Davis 2001. The basis for this agreement was to create a timetable for spearheading a transition government. The new government that took over did not have the capacity to meet the needs of the population. In the remote areas of Afghanistan, no government help was reaching out. The standard of living was rapidly deteriorating and many people started to be impatient. There were no skilled personnel to provide administration duties for the government. The government failed to enforce law and order and provide security to the areas far from Kabul. Many people were highly agitated and this led to the re-emergence of the Taliban insurgency. Therefore, weak governance was a catalyst to the rise of insurgency in Afghanistan. Dupree 2000. Involvement of the U.S. government. The rebellion and the counter-rebellion in Afghanistan started from way back in history. The Soviets had tried to counter the insurgency in Afghanistan and they experienced a big challenge during the Cold War. During this period, the insurgency was spearheaded by the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen are holy warriors and still pose a threat to the NATO and the Americans currently. Davis 2001. This means that the challenges that were faced by the Soviets during the Cold War provide a framework to the Americans and the NATO to have an overview of the challenges. Despite the fact that the strategy of the Soviets for counterinsurgency in Afghanistan was rude, it was highly orchestrated and valid, as opposed to the general perception. Taking a keen look at the performance of the Soviets during the counterinsurgency process only reveals that they failed as a result of insufficient resources. The lack of resources is also a great challenge to the NATO in their current counterinsurgency process. Flood 2012. Since the rebellion started, the Soviets have dealt with a myriad of challenges. These challenges include the terrain of the country, the divided society that was loyal to the ruling administration, and a military that were incapacitated by lack of resources to handle the conflicts. All these three challenges point out to the current environment of operation for the NATO. Despite the fact that the Soviet had a military that consisted of around 10,000 men, it still proved to be inadequate. Davis 2001. Currently, there are more than 10,000 military personnel to handle the insurgency. It is just a matter of time to discover whether the current number of troops will be enough to counter the rebellion. Nevertheless, the Soviets depended so much on the Afghan army to offer them support in countering the insurgency. This was not fruitful. given the fact that the Afghan army lacked the proper training and experience needed. As a result of this, the American government has initiated the task of training the Afghan national military forces to make them more equipped and prepared to counter radical groups. Therefore, the US and the NATO examined the challenges faced by the Soviets and prepared adequately to fight the insurgency. Davis 2001. The ethnic dominance. The emergence of the current insurgency in Afghanistan can be attributed to various theories. Besides the many theories that are in existence, this paper will attribute the emergence of the current insurgency in Afghanistan to insecurity, financial instability, and the recognized marginalization of the Pashtuns. All these happened since the fall of Taliban in the year 2001, Davis 2001. During this period, the Pashtuns were marginalized from holding political positions. As a result of this, the Pashtuns recognized the Tajiks as threats because the Tajiks held various political positions in the interim Afghanistan government. In addition, the emergence of the insurgency is attributed to the less ability of the ineffective local government and the lack of skills and effectiveness of the local security forces to counter rebels. More so, the neighboring Pakistan government offered limited support to fight the insurgency. The fragile relationship between the Pakistan and the Afghanistan began quite a long while back. This has been ascribed to the recorded ideological contrasts. Despite the fact that the Bush Organization and other European pioneers purposed to calm the circumstance, the threatening vibe between the two countries still endured. Pavi 2003. Out of the blue, in light of social, ethnic, and religious associations, the relations among the natives have stayed genuine. Moreover, Pakistan has given brilliant sponsorship to Afghanistan in the midst of the Soviet occupation. It offered refuge to more than 3 million Afghan pariahs and still plays host to very nearly 2 million of them. Rajwade 2001. The coalition forces did not address the logistics of countering the rebels in Afghanistan. This made it more difficult to comprehend the economic and political challenges that were faced by the Pashtuns. Therefore, the reasons for the insurgency as captured in this scenario are political reasons, economic reasons, and revenge and tribal divisions issues. Guffrin 2001. When these challenges faced by the Pashtuns were finally comprehended, much damage had already happened and the insurgency was already on the rise. The main members of the Taliban were the Pashtuns. When the Pashtuns lost connection with the Taliban, they became vulnerable and highly marginalized. At the point when the first interim government was installed, the Pashtuns felt that the Tajiks were highly superior over them. This was because a majority of the governmental positions were occupied by the Tajiks. Gohari 2000. Even though the president, Hamid Karzai, was a Pashtun, much other influential government and political positions were held by the Tajiks. This made the Pashtuns feel inferior. The hostility between the Pashtuns and the Tajiks was further heightened when the Tajiks formed an alliance with other forces to topple the Taliban reign. The grudge and suspicion between the two tribes further increased when the Tajiks were offered key positions in the security docket as a result of the Loya Jirga. More so, many of the available lucrative positions were offered to the Tajiks. Gohari 2000. This was the main catalyst of the insurgency. Inasmuch as the president tried to resolve this issue, he could no manage to convince the Pashtuns to be patient enough to wait for an amicable solution, even though it was evident that progress was being made. The Pashtuns had issues with the control of the security docket and the rebuilding of the region. They argued that even though there was a constitutionally formed administration in place, there was still a laxity from the government and the external partners to deploy enough military personnel to provide security to the region. In addition, they had a concern with the government and the external partners for failing to act quickly and effectively to provide the required resources to rebuild the nation. More so, the Pashtuns had a concern with the way that the central government was reliant and vulnerable to the warlords. This was attributed to the overdependence of the central government on the warlords on key resources and provision of grants. These disappointments and frustrations had a key to starting the insurgency because most of them were attributed to the failure of the central government. Many scholars hold the view that the insurgency was not fueled by the increasing ethnic divisions, especially between the Pashtuns and the Tajiks. Also, they hold the view that the radical groups were not supported by their tribal orientations. Goodson 2001. During the insurgency, not all the Pashtuns gave their full backing to the Taliban, they were only supported by just a number of the Pashtun ethnic community. This means that the Pashtuns were divided amongst themselves in regards to the support to the Taliban. So, tribal division was not a common denominator to cause the insurgency. When elections were held in Afghanistan in 2004, just 2% of the Afghans voted along tribal lines. Therefore, if at all ethnicity played a part in the emergence of the insurgency, it would have been reflected in the election process, where the Afghans would have voted along tribal lines to elect the new president. Goodson 2001. Even though the results of 2004 elections were implemented, it was under harsh criticism, both internally and externally. Furthermore, when tribal divisions are perceived as the motivating factor to the emergence of the insurgency, the subject of ethnic competition is overstated. For sure, the ethnic communities compete for power, but, when this issue is overstated in such a manner, it undermines the non-tribal conflict between the Taliban and the Afghan regime, and also it does not take into account the other alliances existing within Taliban radical groups who have different reasons for their rebellion. Other theorists hold the view that the insurgency in Afghanistan was caused by the farming, production, and sale of poppy. Goodson 2001. Nonetheless, the timing of the season of poppy farming invalidates this theory. In fact, the rise of the poppy farming emerged as a result of the rebellion, but not as a cause of the rebellion. Before the Taliban were subdued, they had kept the production and sale of the drug to lower levels because they used their force and intimidation. This was due to the fact that the Taliban did not participate in the farming and sale of poppy, but rather they got their income from the wealthy donors from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Several studies point out to the fact that the drug trade was escalated by the widespread insecurity and the moribund government. Corruption of the government. Another possible cause of the insurgency is that it might have occurred as a result of corruption. This was attributed to their character of looting and robbing from the people unfairly. The dealings through international trade catalyzed the war because it created so many chances for extortion, thus, fueling the hostility. Therefore, launching a rebellion would be an after effect of corruption and the economic opportunities created by the battles. Inasmuch as Afghanistan is landlocked, it is endowed with many natural resources. But the outcome of the war destroyed much of the resources and the infrastructure that was in place. Goodson 2001. It is, therefore, true to conjecture that the insurgency in Afghanistan was as a result of the inefficiency and the inability of the government to counter and resolve the challenges faced by the country and the citizens. If at all the other theories regarding the emergence of the insurgency are valid, then they will expose the inadequacy of the Afghan government to deal with the rebellion. A stable government will eliminate the trade of drugs and promote healing and reconciliation among the hostile tribes. In addition, the stable government will prosecute the perpetrators of war and rebellion and make them accountable for their deeds. The Afghan National Security Forces, ANSF, and the Afghan National Army, ANA, and the Afghan National Police, ANP, will be left with the troublesome assignment of giving security all through the nation. The forces will most likely be helped by the Americans and other counter-terrorist forces, including intelligence group resources and other conventional forces. On the off chance that the Taliban neglects to make noteworthy additions in the first battling season, yet sees that absence of progress as being because of remaining coalition powers, they may see stalemate as being makeshift and remotely forced. Thus, the guerrillas would likely want to sit tight for further decreases in coalition support before propelling more offensives. To get on the way to an arranged settlement, the Taliban must believe they are stalemated by the solid and reasonable powers of the legislature of Afghanistan. Jacob 2006. Weaknesses of the Afghan National Army and Police. It is an idea of numerous critics that a powerless and a dying national armed force and police is an impetus of the rebellion. Goodson 2001. This is because of the way that when the national armed force and police are frail and shaky, they are unequipped for conveying the best police and security powers to counter the revolt. A compelling national armed force and police can end a war and convey the revolt to an end, since they have the ability to sort out significant foundations that can convey the contentions to an end and advance peace and security. A viable national armed force and police will likewise set up frameworks that inspire the gauges of security among the general population. At the point when there is a change of administration in any national armed force and police, the nation ordinarily experiences a condition of rebellion. This is on the grounds that the large portion of the times, the local frameworks in the nation is incorporated and hierarchic. A frail national armed force and police make it so incomprehensible for it to satisfy the necessities and the yearnings of the developing populace. Numerous fundamental security administrations won't be given. The national armed force and police can't work successfully because of the way that there are no valid organizations to direct their operations. Gohari 2000. As a consequence of these weaknesses, there could be widespread defilement in the nation. The eventual outcomes of debasement would imply that there would be a decrease in the financial development of the nation. Moreover, the tenet of law would be undermined, and in the meantime, the national armed force and police would be not able to supply the fundamental securities to the populace. The ascent of a revolt is an eventual outcome of poor administration in light of the fact that there is poor responsibility with respect to the state, and the guideline of law is profoundly undermined. As of now, the real source of conflict between the two nations is Afghanistan's lost claim that Pakistan has been supporting the foreign invasion and is helping the Taliban and activist strengths to pick up impact. Islamabad intensely denies these assertions and considers it as a strategy by Kabul to strip itself from its own particular obligations and disappointments. Aside from the allegations and counter-allegations, at no other time has there been a more prominent earnestness for the two governments to turn a leaf in their relationship. The two nations confront a genuine test to their respectability and future prospects by a noteworthy resurgence of Taliban and aggressor strengths. Khalilzad 2006. From one viewpoint, the state structures in Afghanistan, which were at that point extremely feeble, have broken down. The Americans, ISAF, and Afghan security strengths have so far neglected to furnish Afghanistan with the security basic to creating national compromise and monetary development. As a result, the nation stays under the strength of a few power centers and has formed many alliances or coalitions. At the point when a nation is viewed as a fizzled state, it is exceedingly unrealistic to deal with its region, for instance, those zones possessed by the radical groups. In his way, the state's power decreases over a substantial portion of the populace. As a consequence of this, the non-state players will be occupied with picking up control of the state because of its inability to deal with its domains. These offers ascend to the development of radical gatherings. In like manner, the more a state loses its power in a zone, the more it gets to be presented and vulnerable to the radicals who wish to shape a parallel national armed force and police. John 2006. Every one of these suppositions can hold on account of Afghanistan. The rise of the uprising in Afghanistan can be ascribed to a feeble administration. In any case, Afghanistan has fizzled twice as a consequence of feeble administration after the Soviet left the nation. In any case, soon after the disappointment of the Soviet administration, the counter-Soviet Mujahideen, who had vanquished the Soviet, picked up control of the state. At this period, numerous warlords utilized the chance to acquire power and practice savagery to satisfy their own advantages and further destabilize the national armed force and police. As an after effect of this, the nation was in a condition of turmoil because of steady clashes and conflicts. Numerous researchers ascribe this period to be the precondition for the development of the insurrection, Gohari 2000. The Taliban figured out how to catch Afghanistan since they were intensely bolstered by the Pakistanis who gave weapons and military staff. The Pakistanis additionally prepared the dissidents and gave specialized backing to the Taliban. When the Taliban caught Afghanistan, they dismantled control more than a few zones from the Panjshir Valley, which was considered to the fortification of the counter-Taliban, Gohari 2000. The new administration that assumed control did not have the ability to address the issues of the populace. In the remote ranges of Afghanistan, no national armed force and police help was connecting. The way of life was quickly falling apart and numerous individuals began to be restless. There was no talented faculty to give organization obligations to the national armed force and police. The national armed force and police neglected to uphold lawfulness and give security to the ranges a long way from Kabul. Numerous individuals were exceptionally fomented and this prompted the redevelopment of the Taliban rebellion. In this way, the powerless administration was an impetus to the ascent of the uprising in Afghanistan, Gohari 2000. External factors. The source of financing an insurgency majorly affects the inspiration of its individuals and the general group resolve. In addition, issues like political authenticity and the direction of the war are affected by the financing structure of the insurgency. In contrast to other cliques that are entirely rendered to be drug terrorists, the Taliban does not exclusively depend on drugs as a method for subsidizing its guerrilla exercises in Afghanistan and without a doubt keeps up assorted sources of financing, combined with a vigorous support system that offers both dynamic and detached support. A section of the Taliban's army is gotten from multi-billion-dollar exchange of merchandise carried from Dubai to Pakistan. The Taliban had gotten to be included in no less than 36 cross-border sneaking syndicates. Other than taxing the drug traffickers, the Taliban additionally runs insurance rackets, engages in blackmail, and also abducts people for payment all through Afghanistan. In 2007, Taliban extremists held a meeting with individuals from the Haqqani network and the TTP to talk about how to arrange a concurrence on partitioning the payment rose from the release of prisoners, Kamal 2011. Outside state support. All through history, the radicals that have been privileged with free access to a place of refuge, either inward or outside. In addition, they have fared more effectively than those agitators without that kind of access. Other than the mainstream support privileged of the Taliban radicals in their Pakistani asylum, the radicals have possessed the capacity to plan, initiate, convert, raise money, and speak with each other. Clearly, the most profitable part of the Taliban's Pakistani asylum is that it permits the agitators to dodge ISAF counterinsurgency operations. The outskirt extends for 2,500 kilometers and is practically outlandish for the alliance troops to watch. In line with the height of the Taliban's rebound in 2007, the boundaries in the middle of Afghanistan and Pakistan were assigned as either threatening or antagonistic situations. The present U.S. structure of humiliating the Taliban to drive it to negotiations is having unplanned effects. The most honest of these is adding to the rise of more youthful, more drastic Taliban officers who are assuming the positions of the neo-Taliban, a cycle of the revolt with a more jihadist internationalist outlook. Pakistan's FATA have been a liberal place of refuge to Al-Qaeda too. Somewhere around 2004 and 2011, of the 30 genuine terrorist plots against the West, more than half had operational or preparing connections to set up jihadist groups in Pakistan. The Taliban has kept up an asylum in Pakistan since being pursued over the outskirt by the American forces. Extraordinary Forces on horseback in November 2001, Khalilzad 2006. The ISI took control of the training camps for Afghan Taliban guerrillas in Pakistan. The America's persistent drone strikes have constrained the capacity of radicals in Pakistan's Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, and FATA to work unreservedly. This is genuine of the Afghan Taliban, as well as of the TTP. The subject of the Taliban's haven in Pakistan has been maybe the most vexing obstruction confronting ISAF in Afghanistan. The place of refuge in Pakistan is an imperative Taliban strength. Notwithstanding the place of refuge given by the Pakistan, the Taliban has likewise reinforced its backing on the Western Front by fortifying its connections to the mullahs in Tehran in a previous couple of years, Khalilzad 2006. Pakistani role. The delicate relationship between the Pakistan and the Afghanistan started several years ago. This has been attributed to the historical ideological differences. Even though the Bush administration and other European leaders purposed to pacify the situation, the hostility between the two nations still persisted, Khalilzad 2006. Unexpectedly, because of social, ethnic, and religious connections, the relations among the citizens have stayed heartfelt. Furthermore, Pakistan has given wonderful backing to Afghanistan amid the Soviet occupation. It offered asylum to more than 3 million Afghan outcasts and still plays host to almost 2 million of them. There are a few reasons why the two governments doubt each other. A noteworthy aggravation is that progressive Afghan governments have yet to completely accommodate themselves to the truth of the Durand Line as the official limit between the two nations. Furthermore, amid times of the Cold War, Afghanistan stayed adjusted to the Soviet camp and Pakistan was an associate of the US and a dynamic individual from the CENTO, Central Treaty Organization, and SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, security settlements. The India component was another bone of conflict, and even today assumes a negative part in their relationship. Islamabad has communicated its profound hesitations about India's foundation of a few departments in the closeness of its outskirts and sees these to be enjoying exercises hindering to its national advantages. Pakistan's moderately substantial size and asset base in contrast with Afghanistan prompt a greater neighbor disorder in the mind of the country. Subsequently, Kabul is constantly uneasy of Pakistan's provincial plans, and the way that Afghanistan is geologically landlocked makes it more reliant and unstable. Starting now, the genuine source of contention between the two countries is Afghanistan's lost claim that Pakistan has been supporting the outside intrusion and is helping the Taliban and extremist qualities to get sway. Islamabad strongly denies these attestations and considers it as a system by Kabul to strip itself from its own specific commitments and disillusionments, Rubin 2010. Besides the charges and counter-assertions, at no other time has there been a more noticeable sincerity for the two governments to turn a leaf in their relationship. The two countries go up against a certifiable test to their respectability and future prospects by an important resurgence of Taliban and assailant qualities. From one perspective, the state structures in Afghanistan, which were by then to a great degree weak, have separated, Rubin 2012. The Americans, ISAF, and Afghan security qualities have so far failed to outfit Afghanistan with the security essential to making a national trade-off and financial improvement. Subsequently, the country stays under the quality of a couple power focuses and has framed numerous organizations together or coalitions. In Pakistan's tribal belt, for the most part, alluded to as the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, circumscribing Afghanistan. The administration's writ has dependably been peripheral, now in numerous ranges, particularly in Waziristan. It does not exist. High mountains, separate valleys, and openness from one locale to the next is troublesome. With regards to the war on dread, solidness of the FATA area is basic for advancing peace and security in Afghanistan, and this is similarly vital for Pakistan. Security of the two nations is consequently commonly reliant and interlaced. The best way to deal with battle uprising pursued by Taliban and other aggressor powers is through close participation and a brought together a vision for the locale. Pakistan's part in Afghanistan will be to a great extent dictated by the advancement made in balancing out the tribal belt and the abutting Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP. While keeping up a specific level of self-governance in FATA, it must be politically and financially incorporated into the nation. FATA in the most recent 6 decades has been horribly dismissed by progressive Pakistani governments. Also, Pakistan's real part in the Afghan jihad and its profound contribution to a cutting-edge state in the fight against terrorism has further radicalized the zone. The approximations made by the American intelligence that Al-Qaeda is rearranging in the tribal has shifted the global consideration and particularly the American consideration for Pakistan. There are, in any case, reports that the Bush organization, keeping in mind the end goal to vindicate itself from the disappointments in Afghanistan and Iraq, has issued data of uncertain veracity. Weight by the US on Pakistan's administration to accomplish more has in any case expanded. The US-led counterinsurgency against the Taliban. There was even talk from the former US President Bush about all choices being open, incorporating one-sided military intercession in the tribal belt. Indeed, even the current Democratic President, Barack Obama, has joined the theme, despite the fact that he has qualified his comments by saying that if at all there is noteworthy knowledge about high-esteem targets, he would arrange surgical operations and military strikes inside the Pakistani domain. Regardless of the debilitating tone of the Bush organization, there was a developing acknowledgement in America that this war had to be won through winning over the hearts and brains of individuals and not by use of military constraint alone. Zief 2010. The no-nonsense of the aggressors must be isolated from the group. The Americans give monetary help of almost $1 billion for the financial and social inspiration of the tribal belt, and the Pakistan is supplementing it with its own assets. This, joined with political changes that would permit political gatherings to work unreservedly in the tribal belt, would, over the long haul, help in fighting fanaticism and militancy. Be that as it may, if by any chance the Americans make a one-sided move in the tribal belt or Baluchistan, it will aggravate the interests of the general population and offer assent to anti-American suppositions. This would likewise destabilize the administration and give Al-Qaeda the chance to win over the nearby backing. From the Americans' point of view, the peace bargains made by Pakistan's army with the activists in the tribal belt have neglected to bring peace. Unexpectedly, they have given a space to the activists to grow their impact inside of the territory and have offered assent to increased militancy. It is highly evident that militancy in FATA is additionally indigenous. There exists a framework of radicalism and terrorism, and this is upheld by certainly capable components in the tribal belt. These structures, framed in Pakistan to battle the control of the Soviets, have not been completely disassembled and have now redeveloped as power centers. Pakistan will need to venture up its endeavors to counter these strengths. One of the fundamental explanations behind the resurgence of the Taliban in both Afghanistan and Pakistan is poor administration and monstrous defilement. The FCR were founded by the British Pilgrim rulers and have been in their present structure in operation since 1903. They have everything except the annual rights that are generally ensured by the Pakistan's constitution. The influx of refugees is another source of erosion in the middle of Islamabad and Kabul. The displaced persons camps have turned into a noteworthy wellspring of enrollment for the Taliban and other activist cliques. A military government that is confined does not have the capacity to battle militancy. permitting the political cliques to work in the tribal belt, and an arrival of regular citizen guideline in Pakistan is prone to lessen the force of the Islamist parties in NWFP and Balochistan. This will positively affect the tribal belt. Killing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda impact from the tribal belt in Afghanistan will require a long-haul exertion, as it requires winning the hearts and psyches of individuals by utilizing all components of national force. Close cooperation at all levels and an outlook of the area shared by Afghanistan's and Pakistan's initiative is vital for the advancement of peace and soundness in the two nations. The meeting of tribal older folks, religious pioneers, and different delegates of power, commonly known as the Resurgence, was held in August 2007. This had an effect of promoting peace and uniting the two fighting factions. Such a procedure ought to lead, at some stage, to an inclusion of the Taliban and other aggressors in the Resurgence to make them more extensive in the base and to draw the anti-government militants into the political fold. The responsiveness of the tribal individuals to the outside power should additionally be considered. Pakistan's administration experiences serious weight from inside because more than 800 armed force staff has died in the Waziristan operations since 2003, and there have been responses by radicals, for instance, rushes of terrorist assaults in various parts of the nation. Taking into account the India-Pakistan experience, there is a requirement for starting the confidence-building measures in the middle of Afghanistan and Pakistan. These ought to be in the zones of peace and security, exchange and monetary matters, and political and social issues. Solid ventures, for example, joint border administration, should be embraced with the backing of the G8 or of the single governments. Political and financial linkages ought to be produced between the two nations. Moreover, closer CO appointment and the harmonization of strategies between the two militaries will contribute toward countering the rebellion adequately. Support to the Taliban resurgence. The rebels needed to be detached from the group. The Americans give billions of dollars to support the rebels, and the Pakistan is supplementing it with its own interests. This, joined with political changes, would allow political social affairs to work in the tribal belt. As time goes on, help is needed in fighting devotion and militancy. In any case, if by any chance the Americans make a rough move in the tribal belt or Balochistan, it will bother the interests of the overall public, and they will resist the American suppositions. This would in like manner destabilize the organization and allow Al-Qaeda to win over the adjacent support. There is in like manner a big gap in the perception between how the community sees the war on terror and the government's vision of it. The roles of FATA, federally administered tribal areas, need to change. It can't stay hardened in time. The military government of Afghanistan, which has been broadly crippled on account of the legitimate crisis and debilitating legality situation in the country, can't have the ability to fight militancy. The most observable complexity all through the insurgency has been the Afghan Taliban's Pakistani spot of asylum in the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, and moreover in genuine urban zones like Karachi, Quetta, and Lahore. In later years, the Taliban has also taken pleasure in a shelter in ranges of Iran. Pakistan is still the favored district, in any case, as it is topographically near the southern and eastern Afghanistan and is home to around 250,000 Pashtuns. 50 million of them live in Afghanistan. In addition, the unpleasant scene of the Afpak limit area makes it ideally suited for avoiding revelation. This test is exacerbated by a less fit and unwilling Pakistani military, which sent its paramilitary Frontier Corps and by and large military segments from the 12th Corps to the FATA in 2004. Beforehand, FATA, federally administered tribal areas, has been used by a couple of clubs, the drug dealers, aggressors, and refugees, as a no-man's land, BANAS 2005. Major political and financial changes must be grasped, remembering the final objective to purposely and progressively consolidate the locale with the straggling leftovers of Pakistan. Political social affairs should be allowed to work in FATA. The organization's available attempts to revive old structures of government in FATA by supporting the tribal pioneers or rulers is far-fetched to succeed in view of the ascent of a successful attacker and distinctive qualities that require an essential affirmation of government force and great grassroots support. People are hopeless with the foreign violations regulations and long for outstanding changes. Close cooperation at all levels and a standpoint of the zone shared by Afghanistan's and Pakistan's drive is crucial for the headway of peace and soundness in the two countries. The meeting of tribal chiefs, religious leaders, and diverse representatives of the military, normally known as the Resurgence, was held. This had an impact of advancing peace and joining the two battling groups. Such a technique should lead, at some stage, to a consideration of the Taliban and different aggressors in the Resurgence to make them broader in the base and to draw the counter-government activists into the political fold. The responsiveness of the tribal people to the outside force ought to be considered. Pakistan's government encounters genuine weight from inside in light of the fact that much military personnel has passed on in the Waziristan operations since 2003 and there have been reactions by radicals, for example, surges of terrorist ambushes in different parts of the country. Considering the India-Pakistan experience, there is a necessity for beginning the certainty-building measures amidst Afghanistan and Pakistan. These should be in the zones of peace and security, trade and fiscal matters and political and social issues. Strong endeavors, for instance, joint outskirt organization ought to be grasped with the support of the G8, Group of 8, countries or of the single governments. Political and budgetary linkages should be created between the two countries. In addition, close CO arrangement and the harmonization of techniques between the two militaries will contribute toward countering the insubordination. The foreign violations regulations were established by the British traveller rulers and have been in their present structure in operation since 1903. They have everything aside from the yearly rights that are for the most part guaranteed by the Pakistan's constitution. The convergence of displaced people is another source of disintegration amidst Islamabad and Kabul. The displaced persons camps have transformed into a huge source of enlistment for the Taliban and other lobbyist inner circles. A military government that is restricted does not have the ability to fight militancy. Allowing the political inner circles to work in the tribal belt and a landing of a normal resident rule in Pakistan is inclined to diminish the power of the Islamist parties in NWFP and Baluchistan. This will emphatically influence the tribal belt. Slaughtering the Taliban and Al-Qaeda's influence from the tribal belt in Afghanistan will require a whole deal effort as it requires winning the hearts and minds of people by using all segments of national power. The Taliban radicals who battled the US and ISAF, International Security Assistance Force, troops were persuaded by an alternate set of factors than the clique of the youthful madrasa understudies that at first were part of the movement in the mid-1990s. At that point, the Taliban was basically inspired by the longing to build up a perfect Islamic state administered by the Sharia law. All things considered, the Taliban's positions were comprised of youthful Afghans who experienced their childhood in the refugee camps of Pakistan, dislodged from the battling of the Soviet-Afghan War. Nowadays, the main motivation of the Taliban is to oust remote troops from Afghan soil. Taking after 12 years of battling against the alliance forces, the Taliban has been truly debased. The most noticeable mystery all through the insurgent has been the Afghan Taliban's Pakistani place of refuge in the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, and in addition in real urban areas like Karachi, Quetta, and Lahore. In later years, the Taliban has additionally delighted in haven in areas of Iran, Khalilzad 2006. Pakistan is still the favored region, nonetheless, as it is geologically close to the southern and eastern Afghanistan and is home to around 250,000 Pashtuns. 50 million of them live in Afghanistan. Besides, the rough landscape of the Afpak boundary district makes it in a perfect world suited for staying away from discovery. This test is exacerbated by a less fit and unwilling Pakistani military, which sent its paramilitary Frontier Corps and generally military components from the 12th Corps to the FATA in 2004. The radicals that have always been favored with free access to a position of shelter. What's more, they have fared more adequately than those instigators without that sort of access. Other than the standard backing advantage of the Taliban radicals in their Pakistani refuge, the radicals have had the ability to arrange, start, change over, raise cash, and talk with each other. Unmistakably, the most beneficial part of the Taliban's Pakistani haven is that it allows the fomenters to avoid ISAF counterinsurgency operations. The edge stretches out for a longer length and is for all intents and purposes shocking for the partnership troops to watch. In accordance with the tallness of the Taliban's rise in 2007, the limits amidst Afghanistan and Pakistan were appointed as either debilitating or adversarial circumstances. Pakistan's FATA have been a liberal spot of shelter to Al-Qaeda as well. Some place around 2004 and 2011, of the 30 honest-to-goodness terrorist plots against the West, more than half had operational or get-ready associations with set-up jihadist bundles in Pakistan. The Taliban has kept up a refuge in Pakistan since being sought after over the edge by the American powers, Marsden 2009. Unprecedented forces on horseback in November 2001. The ISI took control of the preparation camps for Afghan Taliban guerrillas in Pakistan. The America's persistent automaton strikes have obliged the limit of radicals in Pakistan's Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, and FATA to work energetically. This is bona fide of the Afghan Taliban, and in addition of the TTP. The subject of the Taliban's asylum in Pakistan has been perhaps the most vexing check standing up to ISAF in Afghanistan, Madden Udden 2009. The spot of asylum in Pakistan is a basic Taliban quality. Despite the spot of asylum given by the Pakistan, the Taliban has in like manner strengthened its sponsorship on the Western Front by invigorating its associations with the mullahs in Tehran in a past couple of years. Conclusion. The Taliban agitators are in charge of the operations of the Taliban's military. They ordinarily coordinate the war from their territories, which go about as their base. However, the effect of groups like the Haqqani network and associations with both Al-Qaeda and the Tehrik-i-Taliban, TTP, or Pakistani Taliban, show that as the dispute continues, the Afghan Taliban could be influenced by the players with more neighborhood and even overall wishes. The current U.S. arrangement of corrupting the Taliban to drive it to discourse is having spontaneous effects. The most bona fide of these is adding to the climb of more energetic, more radical Taliban officers who are expecting the positions of the neo-Taliban, a cycle of the rebellion with a more jihadist internationalist point of view. The delicate relationship between the Pakistan and the Afghanistan started many years ago. This has been attributed to the recorded ideological differentiations. In spite of the way that the Americans and other European pioneers purposed to quiet the condition, the undermining vibe between the two nations still persevered. Suddenly, in light of social, ethnic, and religious affiliations, the relations among the locals have stayed certifiable. In addition, Pakistan has given splendid sponsorship to Afghanistan amidst the Soviet occupation. It offered asylum to more than 3 million Afghan outsiders and still plays host to practically 2 million of them.